They rejected her before she even stepped off the wagon, and by sundown, she was standing alone in a town that had already decided her worth. Clara Whitfield held the edge of her worn suitcase like it might anchor her to something solid, but the wind that moved through Dry Creek carried dust instead of mercy, and every pair of eyes watching her felt like judgment carved in stone. "Not what I ordered," the man had said, not even bothering to lower his voice, as if she were an object returned to a store, as if the miles she'd traveled and the hope she'd carried across half a continent could be dismissed with a shrug. The others had laughed, quiet at first, then louder when no one stepped in to stop it, and Clara learned something in that moment that no letter back east had warned her about. Out here, rejection wasn't private, it was a performance. She turned away before her hands could betray her, before her face could crack, and started walking with no direction except away, her boots sinking slightly into the dry road, each step heavier than the last. The sun hung low, painting the wooden buildings in tired gold, and the smell of horse leather and old smoke clung to the air like it had nowhere else to go. Somewhere behind her, a door slammed. Somewhere else a man called out for whiskey, and life in Dry Creek continued as if she had never existed. That was the first thing the West took from you, she realized. Not your belongings, not your plans, but your place in the world. You could disappear here, and the dust would swallow your footprints before nightfall. She might have kept walking until the horizon blurred into darkness if not for the sound. A low, uneven shift of gravel near the edge of the street, almost too quiet to notice unless you were already listening for something different. Clara paused, turning just enough to see a figure half-shadowed beside a broken fence, a man seated on the ground like he had simply run out of strength halfway through standing. His hat lay beside him, and without it, his hair caught the last light in dull strands, his shirt worn thin at the elbows, boots scuffed past repair. No one else looked his way. No one slowed. It was as if he existed just outside the line where people decided something mattered. Clara hesitated, her fingers tightening around the suitcase handle, because she had nothing left to give, not even to herself, and helping someone else felt like a risk she could not afford. But then he shifted slightly, a small movement, controlled, like he was careful not to draw attention, and that was what stopped her. Not weakness, not desperation, control. She had seen enough men pretend its strength to recognize when it wasn't needed. Slowly, she stepped closer, the boards of the nearby fence creaking in the breeze, her boots crunching softly against the dirt. Up close, he looked worse than he had from a distance, but something about him didn't match the picture, a line in his posture, the way his hand rested near his side, steady even in stillness. His eyes lifted to meet hers, and they were clear, too clear for a man who had nothing. "You lost?" he asked, his voice quiet, rough, but even, like it didn't need to prove anything. Clara almost laughed at that, but the sound caught somewhere behind her ribs. "Something like that," she said, and the words felt heavier than they should. He nodded once, like that was enough, like he didn't need the rest of the story. Most men would have asked. Most men would have filled the silence with assumptions. He didn't. The wind moved again, carrying a chill that hinted at the coming night, and Clara became suddenly aware of how thin her coat was, how far she was from anything resembling safety. She glanced back toward the center of town, where lanterns were beginning to flicker to life, where laughter still drifted without her. "You should find somewhere before it gets dark," he said, not unkind, just matter of fact. Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "You know a place?" she asked. His gaze held hers for a moment longer than necessary, measuring something she couldn't name, and then he gestured faintly toward the far edge of town, where the buildings thinned and the land stretched out in uneven patches of scrub and shadow. "There's a shack about half a mile out," he said. "Roof leaks, door sticks. No one will bother you." There. It wasn't much. It was barely anything, but it was more than she had been offered all day. Clara nodded, adjusting her grip on the suitcase, and turned in the direction he'd indicated. She took a few steps before something pulled her back, something she couldn't explain, and when she looked over her shoulder, he was watching her still, not with pity, not with expectation, just watching, like he was waiting to see what kind of person she would be when no one was looking. The light faded another shade, the sky deepening into a bruised purple, and Clara made a choice she would not understand until much later. She set her suitcase down in the dirt, turned fully, and walked back toward the man by the broken fence. "Can you stand?" she asked quietly, and for the first time, something shifted in his expression, something small but real, like a door opening just enough to let the truth breathe. He did not answer right away, and for a moment Clara wondered if she had misread him entirely, if that quiet steadiness was nothing more than exhaustion dressed up as control. But then his hand pressed against the ground, and he shifted his weight with a careful precision that did not belong to a man who had given up on himself. And that was when she understood that whatever had brought him down, it had not broken him, not yet. "I can," he said finally, his voice low, almost thoughtful, as if standing were a decision rather than a reflex. And when he rose, it was slow but deliberate. No wasted motion, no sign of panic, just a man choosing to move when he needed to. Up close, he was taller than she had expected, shoulders broader beneath the worn fabric. And there was something else there, something that did not fit the image of a man who slept beside broken fences and let the town forget him. Clara picked up her suitcase again, though it felt lighter now for reasons she could not explain, and nodded toward the direction he had pointed earlier. "Half a mile," she said, more to herself than to him, and he gave a small nod in return, as if confirming a detail in a plan neither of them had spoken out loud. They walked without saying much, the distance stretching between the last buildings of Dry Creek and the open land beyond, where the ground turned uneven and the wind carried a sharper edge, threading through scrub and dry grass with a restless whisper. The town behind them faded quickly, its noise swallowed by space. And with each step, Clara felt something shift inside her, something quieter than fear, but just as present, the sense that she had crossed a line she could not step back over. The shack appeared slowly, almost reluctantly, a leaning structure with weathered boards and a roof that dipped in the middle like it had given up holding its shape, and the door hung slightly crooked on its hinges, moving just enough with the wind to let out a soft, rhythmic creak. "Home," he said, not with pride, not with shame, just stating a fact, and Clara could not tell if he meant it. She stepped inside first, pushing the door open with her shoulder, and the smell of dust and old wood met her immediately, thick but not unbearable, like a place that had been used just enough to survive. There was a small table near the window, a chair missing one rung, and a narrow bed pushed against the wall, its blanket folded with a care that stood out against everything else. The town had judged him correctly. Something shifting again in his expression, something deeper this time, like recognition. He stepped forward, slower than before, and took the bread with a care that suggested it was worth more than it looked, breaking it in half, and setting a portion back on the table in front of her without a word. The fire crackled softly behind them, the light steady now, and outside, the last trace of daylight disappeared, leaving only the vast, quiet dark of the open land. Clara sat down, her hands resting lightly on the table, and for the first time since she had stepped into Dry Creek, she did not feel invisible, not entirely, and she did not yet know that somewhere beneath the floorboards, beneath the careful order and the silence, something else waited, something that would change the meaning of everything she had just chosen to do. The fire settled into a steady rhythm, low and constant, and for a while neither of them spoke, the kind of silence that did not demand to be filled, but instead pressed gently against the edges of thought, giving space for things to surface on their own. Clara sat with her hands wrapped loosely around the tin cup she had found on the shelf, the metal warming slowly from the heat of the flames, and she watched Ethan from across the table, without making it obvious, studying the small details he did not seem to notice he revealed. The way he ate was careful, measured, not rushed like a man who had gone too long without food, but deliberate, like someone used to rationing more than just supplies. His posture stayed straight even when he leaned back, his shoulders never fully dropping, and every so often, his gaze shifted not to the door or the window, but to the floor, to a spot near the corner where the boards met unevenly. It was subtle, easy to miss, but Clara had spent too much of her life reading what people did not say to ignore it now. "You keep things tidy," she said after a while, her voice quiet enough not to break the calm entirely, and Ethan glanced around the room as if seeing it through her eyes for the first time. "Easier that way," he replied, and there was something behind the words, something about control, about keeping order where everything else could not be trusted. Clara nodded, letting the conversation settle again. But her attention did not leave that corner of the floor. The firelight shifted, casting shadows that moved just enough to reveal the slightest difference in the wood, a seam that did not quite match the others, a line that suggested something had been opened before and closed again with care. She did not ask about it, not yet, because she had learned that the fastest way to lose the truth was to reach for it too quickly. Instead, she stood and moved toward the bed, adjusting the blanket, smoothing it out in a way that gave her hands something to do, something to ground her in the moment. "You should rest," she said, not turning back immediately. And when she did, Ethan was already watching her, that same quiet focus in his eyes, as if every word she spoke carried more weight than it should. "You sound like you have done this before," he said, and Clara paused, her fingers still on the edge of the blanket, the fabric rough beneath her touch. "Taking care of people," he added, and she let out a slow breath, not quite a sigh. "I have had to," she answered, and that was all she gave him, because some histories were not meant to be unpacked in a single night, especially not in a place like this, where the walls felt like they listened. Ethan nodded once, accepting the boundary without pressing further, and that alone told Clara more about him than any answer might have. Most men demanded explanations. Most men believed they were owed them. He did not. He simply shifted his weight and moved toward the bed, lowering himself onto it with that same careful control, as if even rest required intention. Clara returned to the table, gathering the small things she had taken out, folding them back into her suitcase with quiet efficiency, but her mind stayed on the details she had noticed: the watch, the posture, the floor. None of it fit together cleanly, and yet it all pointed in the same direction, towards something hidden not just beneath the boards, but beneath the man himself. Outside, the wind picked up again, brushing against the walls in uneven gusts, and somewhere in the distance, a loose piece of wood knocked softly against another, a hollow, rhythmic sound that carried across the open land. Clara listened for a moment, then frowned slightly. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her head tilting just enough to catch the direction of the noise, and Ethan's eyes lifted, not with surprise, but with recognition. "Just the wind," he said, but the answer came a fraction too quickly, and Clara noticed. She stepped closer to the door, pressing her hand lightly against it, feeling the vibration of the air outside, the subtle shift that suggested more than just empty space. It was not footsteps. Not exactly. But it was not nothing either. She turned back slowly, meeting Ethan's gaze, and for a brief moment, something passed between them, something unspoken but understood, the awareness that the world outside this small shack had not forgotten them, even if the town had. "You expecting anyone?" she asked, her voice lower now, more cautious, and Ethan held her gaze for a long second before answering. "No," he said, and this time, the word carried weight, not just meaning. Clara nodded, but she did not move away from the door, not yet. Instead, she stood there, listening, feeling the tension shift in the room, subtle but real, like a thread being pulled tighter between 2 points. The fire crackled behind them, steady and warm, but it no longer felt like enough to hold back the cold that seemed to creep in from the edges. After a moment, the sound outside faded, swallowed again by the wind, and the stillness returned, but it was different now, sharper, more aware. Clara stepped back from the door and returned to the table, her movements slower, more deliberate, and she sat down once more, her hands resting lightly in front of her. "You are not what they said," she said quietly, not accusing, not questioning, just stating a truth she had begun to see. Ethan's expression did not change much, but something in his eyes softened, just a fraction. "Neither are you," he replied, and for a moment, that was enough. The fire burned low, the night deepened, and in that small space between two strangers, something fragile began to take shape, something built not on promises or appearances, but on choices made when no one was watching. If you have made it this far into the story, leave a comment and a like, because what happens next will change everything they think they know. The night did not settle the way it should have. It lingered, stretched thin across the land like something waiting to be noticed, and Clara felt it long before she could name it. The way the air shifted just slightly between breaths. The way the quiet carried weight instead of peace. She did not sleep right away. Even after the fire burned lower, and Ethan lay back against the narrow bed, his eyes closed but not entirely at rest, because there was a difference between someone sleeping and someone choosing stillness, and she had begun to recognize that difference in him. Clara sat by the table a while longer, her fingers tracing the edge of the tin cup, her gaze drifting again and again to that same corner of the floor, the uneven seam that refused to blend into the rest of the boards no matter how she tried to ignore it. The wind outside softened for a time, then returned in slow pulses, brushing against the walls like a quiet reminder that this place, this fragile shelter, stood alone in a wide and indifferent world. At some point, exhaustion claimed her, not gently but all at once, and she drifted into a shallow sleep with her back against the wall, the faint glow of embers casting shadows that moved without sound. She woke before dawn, though she could not say what had stirred her, only that the silence had changed again, sharper now, more defined, like the space between notes in a song you do not yet understand. The fire had nearly died, leaving only a soft red glow, and the air inside the shack had cooled enough to make her draw her coat tighter around her shoulders. Ethan was not on the bed. For a brief second, something tightened in her chest, a flicker of the same fear she had felt when she first stepped into Dry Creek, the fear of being left without warning, without explanation. But then she heard it, a faint sound beneath her feet, not from outside this time, but from below. Clara held still, listening, her breath slow and measured. And there it was again, a subtle shift, the faintest echo of movement where there should have been nothing at all. She rose carefully, each step placed with intention, moving toward that corner of the room where the boards met unevenly, where the seam had caught her attention the night before. The light was still dim, but enough filtered through the narrow window to outline the difference in the wood, the slight lift at one edge, the suggestion of a space beneath. She knelt, her fingers hovering for a moment before pressing gently against the board, testing it, feeling the give that confirmed what she already suspected. It was not nailed down the same way as the others. It was meant to be opened. Clara hesitated, not because she feared what she might find, but because she understood that once she looked, there would be no returning to not knowing. And in a place like this, knowledge carried its own kind of weight. The sound came again, closer now, and that decided it. She slid her fingers beneath the edge and lifted. The board rose with surprising ease, revealing a narrow space below, dark but not empty. A soft breath escaped her before she could stop it, not from shock, but from the quiet certainty that everything she had begun to sense was real. There were items carefully placed beneath, wrapped in cloth, arranged with the same precision she had seen in the rest of the shack, nothing scattered, nothing wasted. She reached down slowly, her hand brushing against the fabric, feeling the shape beneath it, solid, deliberate, and when she drew it up into the dim light, the cloth fell back just enough to reveal a glint that did not belong to a man who lived on scraps and silence. Coins. Not many, but enough. Enough to change how a person moved through the world. Enough to make the difference between being ignored and being sought. Clara stared at them for a long moment, her thoughts shifting, rearranging, trying to understand the man she had chosen to trust without knowing why. Behind her, the door opened with a soft creak, and she did not turn immediately, because she already knew who it was, already felt the presence before the sound confirmed it. "You found it," Ethan said, not accusing, not surprised, just stating a fact, and there was something in his voice that carried more than the words themselves, something like acceptance. Clara placed the cloth back over the coins, her movements calm, deliberate, and only then did she turn to face him, the early light outlining his figure in the doorway, the horizon behind him just beginning to pale with the promise of morning. "You are not broke," she said quietly, and it was not a question. Ethan stepped inside, closing the door behind him with the same controlled ease she had come to expect, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the space between them filled with everything that had not been said the night before. "No," he answered finally, his gaze steady on hers, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any explanation. Clara studied him, the lines of his face, the way he held himself, the quiet strength that no longer felt hidden but chosen, and she realized something then that shifted everything again, something deeper than the coins, deeper than the secret beneath the floor. He had not been hiding from the world. He had been waiting, And now, standing there in the thin light of dawn, with the truth laid bare between them, Clara understood that the choice she had made the night before had placed her in the center of something far larger than a broken shack and a stranger's need, something that would not stay hidden for much longer. Clara did not step away from the open floorboard right away, even after Ethan spoke, because the truth sitting between them felt too precise to disturb, like something balanced on a blade that could tip in either direction depending on what was said next, and she had learned to wait, to let silence reveal what words might hide. The early light grew stronger, stretching across the rough boards and catching the edge of the cloth still covering the coins, and for a moment, the small space beneath the floor looked less like a hiding place and more like a choice made over and over again, a decision to keep something close while letting the world believe otherwise. Clara lowered the board back into place with care, pressing it down until it settled flush with the rest, her fingers lingering for just a second as if marking the spot in her memory. "You could have used it," she said quietly, turning back toward Ethan. "Could have stayed in town, bought yourself a proper place, a warm bed, respect." The last word held just enough weight to show she understood what it meant out here, how quickly people assigned it, and how easily they took it away. Ethan did not answer immediately. He moved further into the room, setting something down on the table without looking at it, his attention still on her, steady and unreadable. "Respect that can be bought is not worth keeping," he said after a moment, and the way he spoke made it sound less like an opinion and more like something learned the hard way. Clara studied him, the calm in his posture, the absence of defensiveness, and she realized that whatever story had shaped him into this man, it had stripped away anything unnecessary, leaving only what he chose to carry. "Then what is it for?" she asked, not pressing, just following the thread he had allowed her to see. Ethan's gaze shifted briefly toward the corner where the floorboard lay, then back to her. "Time," he said simply. Clara frowned slightly, not in confusion but in consideration, because that answer did not close the question, it opened it wider. Before she could ask more, a sound carried faintly from the distance, not the wind this time, not the soft shifting of empty land, but something more defined, a rhythm that did not belong to nature alone. Clara's head turned instinctively toward the door, her body already attuned to the difference, and she saw the way Ethan's posture changed, not dramatically, not enough for someone unfamiliar to notice, but enough for her to recognize. He was listening, not for danger, for arrival. "You said you were not expecting anyone," she said, her voice lower now, not accusing, just aligning what she had heard with what he had told her. Ethan stepped toward the door, opening it just enough to let the morning air slip inside, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the land met the sky in a thin, pale line. "I am not," he replied, but there was no tension in the words, no urgency, only a quiet readiness that settled over him like something practiced. Clara moved beside him, following his line of sight, and at first she saw nothing, just the wide stretch of open ground, the soft light spreading slowly across it. But then, far off in the distance, she caught it, a faint movement, a shifting of shapes that did not belong to the land itself. Riders. Not many. Not yet. But enough to matter. Clara felt her breath slow, not from fear, but from the realization that whatever she had stepped into the night before was beginning to move, to reveal itself piece by piece, whether she was ready or not. "Friends?" she asked, her eyes still on the horizon, and Ethan's answer came after a pause that was just long enough to carry meaning. "Depends on the day," he said, and there was something almost dry in the tone, something that suggested the line between friend and stranger was thinner than most people believed. The riders grew clearer as the light strengthened, their pace steady, not rushed, not hesitant, and Clara noticed something else then, something that made her shift her weight slightly without realizing it. They were not riding like men looking for something to take. They were riding like men who already knew where they were going. She glanced at Ethan, searching his face for a sign, any indication of how he intended to meet what was coming. But he remained as he had been since she met him, calm, measured, unreadable in the ways that mattered most. "You should go," he said suddenly, not turning toward her, his eyes still on the approaching figures, and the words landed between them with a quiet certainty that left no room for misunderstanding. Clara did not move. "You told me to stay last night," she replied, her voice steady, not challenging, just stating what had been said. Ethan's jaw shifted slightly, the smallest sign of something beneath the surface, and when he finally looked at her, there was a weight there that had not been present before. "Last night was different," he said. Clara held his gaze, the space between them narrowing not in distance but in understanding, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because some decisions did not need words. They needed only the clarity of what was already known. She stepped back from the doorway, not toward the outside, but deeper into the shack, her hand resting briefly on the table as if grounding herself in the choice she was making. "So is this morning," she said quietly, and in that moment, something shifted again, something unspoken but undeniable, the line between them no longer drawn by circumstance but by intention. Outside, the riders continued their approach, the distance closing slowly but steadily, and the quiet of the land held its breath as if waiting to see what would happen next. The riders did not slow as they came closer, and that was the first thing Clara noticed. Not their number, not their faces, but the way they moved with purpose, like men who had no need to question the path beneath them. And beside her, Ethan remained still, his presence steady in a way that did not push back against what was coming, but did not yield to it either. The morning light stretched wider now, brushing the land in pale gold, revealing more detail with every passing second, and Clara could see them clearly at last, for riders, spaced evenly, their horses calm, their posture upright. And there was something about the way they held themselves that set them apart from the men in Dry Creek, something quieter, more certain, as if they answered to something beyond the opinions of a small town. She felt her hands relax at her sides without realizing it, the tension easing not because the situation was safe, but because it was not chaotic, and that difference mattered more than she would have expected. Ethan stepped forward out of the doorway, not far, just enough to stand where he could be seen clearly, and Clara followed without being asked, stopping a pace behind him, not out of fear, but out of instinct, the understanding that this moment belonged to him, and she was choosing to remain within it. Man at the front inclined his head slightly, not in submission, not in challenge, but in acknowledgement, and Ethan returned the gesture with a subtle dip of his chin that carried more meaning than any greeting could have. "You took your time," Ethan said, his voice even, carrying just enough to reach them without force, and the lead rider allowed the corner of his mouth to lift in something close to a restrained smile. "The road does not rush for anyone," he replied, his tone calm, his English precise but touched with a cadence that hinted at a different origin, one Clara could not place but recognized as belonging to a wider world than the narrow streets of Dry Creek. Clara watched the exchange closely, noting what was said and what was not, the absence of suspicion, the absence of explanation, as if both sides already understood the terms of something long established. Her gaze shifted briefly to the other riders, and she noticed the details she had not expected, the careful way their gear was maintained, the quiet attention in their eyes, not fixed on her, not fixed on the shack, but on Ethan, as if he were the center of whatever had brought them here. "We heard you were still here," the lead rider continued, his eyes steady, "and that the town has not changed." Ethan let out a breath that was not quite a laugh, more a recognition of something that had never needed to be confirmed. "The town rarely does," he said, and there was no bitterness in it, only fact. Clara felt something shift again, a piece of understanding sliding into place, because this was not a man hiding from the world. This was a man who had stepped aside from it, who had chosen distance not out of weakness, but out of clarity. The lead rider's gaze moved then, briefly, to Clara, not lingering, not probing, just taking note, and when it returned to Ethan, there was a subtle question there, unspoken but present. Ethan did not answer it directly. "She stayed," he said instead, and the words carried a quiet weight that made Clara feel the ground beneath her feet in a new way, as if the choice she had made the night before had just been placed on a scale she had not known existed. The rider nodded once, slow and deliberate, as if that was the only answer that mattered, and something in his posture shifted, a fraction of tension released, a fraction of respect acknowledged. "Then it is as it should be," he said, and Clara did not fully understand the meaning, but she felt it, the way the air seemed to settle around the words, the way the moment deepened rather than passed. Ethan stepped forward another half pace, his attention returning fully to the man before him. "You did not come just to see if I was still breathing," he said. And again, there was that quiet edge of knowing, the sense that this conversation had layers she was only beginning to see. The rider's expression remained calm, but his eyes sharpened slightly, not with concern, but with purpose. "No," he said, "we came because it is time." The words hung there, simple but heavy, and Clara felt them before she understood them, the way a storm can be sensed before the first drop falls. Ethan did not react outwardly, but she saw it, the smallest shift in his shoulders, the almost imperceptible change in the way he held his stance, like a man aligning himself with something inevitable. "Time for what?" Clara asked quietly before she could stop herself, the question slipping into the space between them, and for the first time, the lead rider looked at her directly, not with surprise, not with dismissal, but with a calm that suggested he had expected her to speak eventually. "For what was set aside to be brought forward," he said, his voice steady, and though the answer was not clear, it carried a certainty that made it real all the same. Clara glanced at Ethan, searching his face for something to anchor herself to, some explanation that would make sense of the pieces now moving around her. But he only looked back at her with that same quiet steadiness, and in his eyes, she saw it. Not fear, not hesitation, but a question turned back toward her, not in words, but in presence. "Would you stay now that you know there is more?" The wind moved softly across the land again, carrying the faint scent of dust and something else, something like change, and Clara felt her answer settle inside her without needing to speak it out loud, because she had already chosen once, and this was simply the continuation of that choice. The rider inclined his head again, as if something unspoken had been confirmed, and the moment stretched just long enough to be remembered before it shifted forward into whatever came next. And if you have stayed with this story until now, thank you for listening this far, because what is about to unfold will not be what anyone in that small town ever expected. The word time did not fade after it was spoken. It settled into the space like something alive, something that did not need to be explained to carry weight, and Clara felt it in the stillness that followed, in the way even the horses seemed to hold their breath, as if they understood more than she did. Ethan did not respond immediately, and that silence stretched just long enough to feel intentional, not hesitation, but acknowledgement, like a man stepping into a moment he had already seen coming from miles away. He glanced once toward the shack behind them, toward the place where the floorboards hid more than just coins, then back to the rider in front of him. "I thought I had more of it," he said quietly, and there was no regret in his voice, only a recognition of something that had reached its end. The lead rider gave a slight nod, as if the answer confirmed what he already knew. "Time does not ask," he replied, his tone calm, steady, the kind of certainty that did not argue. "It arrives." Clara stood just behind Ethan, her eyes moving between them, trying to follow a conversation that felt older than she was, built on decisions made long before she ever stepped into Dry Creek. She could feel it now, the shape of something larger forming around them, something that made the shack, the coins, even the town itself seem smaller, like pieces in a story that had been waiting to turn. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, his gaze steady on the rider. "And if I say not yet?" he asked, not challenging, just testing the edge of the moment. The rider's expression did not change, but something in his eyes deepened, like the surface of still water revealing its depth when the light shifts. "Then it will still be time," he said, and there was no threat in it, no pressure, only truth delivered without decoration. Clara felt her breath slow as she listened, because this was not a conversation about force, it was about inevitability, about something that did not need to push to move forward. Ethan let out a quiet breath, his shoulders settling just slightly, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a different tone, not resistance, not acceptance, but alignment. "I will need to prepare," he said, and the rider inclined his head once more. "We will wait," he replied, and the words carried a patience that made Clara understand something important. Whatever this was, it was not urgent in the way danger was urgent, it was certain in the way seasons were certain. Ethan turned then, not abruptly, not with urgency, but with purpose, and walked back toward the shack, and Clara followed without being told, her steps matching his as if the choice had already been made. Inside, the air still held the warmth of the fire, though the flames had faded to embers, and the small space felt different now, not smaller, but clearer, like the truth had shifted the weight of everything within it. Ethan moved directly to the corner, kneeling beside the uneven boards, and this time he did not hesitate, did not hide the motion. He lifted the plank with steady hands and reached beneath it, retrieving the cloth-wrapped bundle Clara had seen before. He placed it on the table and unwrapped it fully, revealing not just the coins, but other items she had not seen in the dim light. A folded document sealed with a mark she did not recognize, a small piece of metal etched with careful lines, and beneath it all, another layer of something that looked less like wealth and more like responsibility. Clara stepped closer, her eyes moving over the objects, not touching, just observing, because she understood now that these were not things meant to impress, they were things meant to matter. "You said it was for time," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the shift in everything around her, and Ethan nodded without looking up. "It is," he replied, his fingers moving with practiced care as he arranged the items, as if each one held a place not just on the table, but in a larger pattern. Clara watched him for a moment longer, then asked the question that had been building since dawn. "And now?" Ethan paused, just briefly, then looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw something new, not distance, not guardedness, but clarity, the kind that comes when a man no longer has the option to remain unseen. "Now it is for something else," he said, and though the answer was simple, it carried a weight that settled deep. Outside, the riders remained where they were, their presence steady, patient, not pressing forward, not pulling away, and Clara realized that this moment, this quiet preparation inside a broken shack, mattered more than anything that would follow, because it was here that the choice became real. She glanced at the door, then back at Ethan, and for a brief moment, the question rose again, not spoken, but felt, whether she still belonged in this story now that it had revealed its true shape. Ethan seemed to sense it, because he straightened slightly and met her gaze, not with expectation, not with demand, but with something far more rare, an offering without condition. "You can still leave," he said, his voice calm, not pushing her away, but giving her space to choose, and Clara felt the weight of that more than anything else he had shown her. She looked around the shack, at the table, the fire, the floorboards, then back at him, and something settled inside her, something steady and certain. "I stayed when there was nothing," she said quietly. "I am not leaving now that there is something." Ethan held her gaze for a long second, and then, slowly, he nodded, not in surprise, not in relief, but in recognition, as if the answer had been part of the pattern all along. Outside, the wind moved again, softer now, carrying the faint sound of horses shifting in place, and the morning stretched wider, opening the path ahead whether they were ready or not. The room felt smaller once the truth had been placed out in the open, not because the walls had moved, but because the space between choices had narrowed, and Clara could feel it in the way the air carried. A different weight, the way every movement Ethan made now seemed to follow a line she could not yet see but knew was there. He finished arranging the items on the table with a quiet precision, folding the cloth back over the coins, but leaving the document and the etched metal piece uncovered, as if those were meant to be seen now, meant to exist outside the hidden space beneath the floor. Clara stepped closer, her eyes drawn to the document, the seal pressed into it unfamiliar but deliberate, a mark that spoke of authority without needing to explain itself. "You have been waiting a long time," she said softly, not as a guess, but as something she had come to understand in the rhythm of his actions, in the way he had chosen stillness over comfort. Ethan did not deny it. "Long enough to know that waiting changes nothing on its own," he replied, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table, not gripping, not tense, just present. Clara glanced toward the door, where the light had grown stronger, the morning now fully awake, and beyond it, she could still sense the riders, their patience stretching across the land like a quiet promise. "And they have been waiting too," she added, and Ethan gave a small nod, acknowledging the truth in that. "Not for me," he said, "for what comes next." The words settled into her, and Clara felt the shape of them begin to form, not fully clear, but enough to understand that whatever this was, it was not about one man or one moment. It was about something that moved beyond both. She reached out then, not to take anything, but to touch the edge of the table, grounding herself in the reality of it, the wood solid beneath her fingers, the items before her no longer hidden. "Then tell me," she said quietly, meeting his eyes, "what comes next?" Ethan looked at her for a long second, and in that look, she saw the measure of the question, not in its words, but in its consequence, because once spoken, the answer would change not just her understanding, but her place in everything that followed. He exhaled slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of the weight of choosing to speak. "This land," he began, his voice even, steady, "does not belong to the town the way they think it does." Clara felt her attention sharpen, her mind pulling together the pieces she had seen, the writers, the document, the way the lead man had spoken with certainty rather than request. "Then who does it belong to?" she asked, her voice low, careful not to rush the answer. Ethan's gaze shifted briefly to the document, then back to her. "To those who never left it," he said, and though the words were simple, they carried a depth that made the room feel even quieter. Clara's thoughts moved quickly, not in confusion, but in realization, because she had seen enough, heard enough, to understand what he was not saying directly. The writers, the way they moved, the way they spoke. "And you are the one who holds it," she said, not as a question, but as the conclusion that now seemed unavoidable. Ethan did not confirm it with words. He simply met her gaze, and that was enough. Outside, a soft sound carried through the open space, the shift of a horse, the faint jingle of tack, and it felt less like interruption and more like a reminder that time was continuing, that the moment inside the shack was part of something already in motion. Clara drew a slow breath, letting it settle, because this was not a revelation that demanded reaction, it demanded understanding. "That is why you stayed out here," she said, her voice steady. "Why you let them believe you had nothing." Ethan nodded once, the motion small but certain. "It is easier to protect something when no one believes it is worth taking," he said, and Clara felt the truth of that settle deeper than anything else he had said so far. She looked around the shack again, seeing it now not as a place of lack, but as a place of choice, every worn board, every simple object part of a deliberate decision to remain unseen. "And now they know," she said, glancing toward the door again, where the light continued to grow, where the presence outside waited without pressing. Ethan followed her gaze, then looked back at her. "Now it is meant to be known," he replied, and there was something final in the way he said it, not ending, but beginning. Clara felt something shift inside her then, not fear, not doubt, but a quiet alignment with the moment, the same kind of steadiness she had seen in him from the beginning, and she realized that the choice she had made to stay was no longer about him alone. It was about what she had become by staying. "Then we should not keep them waiting," she said, and the words felt natural, not forced, as if they had been waiting for her to catch up to them. Ethan studied her for a brief moment, something like approval passing through his expression, not given lightly, but not withheld either, and then he gathered the document and the metal piece, leaving the coins where they were, covered once more, as if their purpose had already been served. He moved toward the door, and Clara followed, the two of them stepping out into the full light of morning, where the land stretched wide and open, where the riders waited with the same quiet patience they had held from the start. The lead rider inclined his head again as they approached, his gaze moving from Ethan to Clara and back, taking in what had changed without needing it explained. "You are ready," he said, not asking, and Ethan answered with a single nod. Clara stood beside him, the wind brushing lightly against her coat, the open land no longer feeling empty, but full of something she could not yet name, something that felt like it had been there all along, waiting for someone to see it clearly. And as the moment settled into motion, as the quiet gave way to what would follow, Clara understood that this was not the end of the story she had stepped into. It was the point where it truly began. They did not mount their horses right away, and that was the first sign that whatever came next was not about speed or distance, but about understanding, about stepping forward with intention rather than urgency, and Clara felt it in the way the air held steady around them, the way no one reached for reins or turned away from the moment. The lead rider shifted slightly in his saddle, his gaze moving once more between Ethan and Clara, not measuring, not judging, but recognizing, as if something had aligned in a way that no longer required doubt. "Then we begin here," he said, his voice calm, carrying across the open ground without force, and Ethan inclined his head in agreement. The motion simple but final, like a door closing quietly behind a long wait. Clara stood beside him, her hands at her sides, the wind brushing lightly against her coat, and for the first time since she had arrived in this place, she did not feel like she was standing at the edge of something unfamiliar. She felt like she was standing within it, part of it, her presence no longer accidental but chosen. The rider gestured subtly toward the land stretching beyond the shack, a wide expanse of dry earth and low brush that seemed unchanged at first glance. But Clara could sense now that there was more beneath it, more in the way it was seen, in the way it was held. "There are lines here," the rider said, his words measured, not drawn with fences, not marked by posts, but known. Clara followed his gaze, her eyes tracing the horizon, the gentle rise and fall of the land, and she realized that what he spoke of was not something visible, but something understood, something carried by those who belonged to it in a way the town never could. Ethan stepped forward a half pace, his attention fixed on the space the rider had indicated. "And they have been ignored," he said quietly, not as a complaint, but as a fact that had shaped everything that followed. The rider nodded once, the motion carrying both agreement and something deeper, something like patience worn thin over time. "Ignored, forgotten, and taken for empty," he replied, and Clara felt the weight of those words settle into the ground beneath her feet, into the silence that followed. She glanced back toward the direction of Dry Creek, though it lay out of sight beyond the rise, and she could almost hear it, the laughter, the dismissal, the easy way people had treated what they did not understand as if it did not matter. "And now?" she asked, her voice steady, not breaking the quiet, but joining it, and the rider's gaze returned to her, calm and certain. "Now it is remembered," he said, and there was something in the way he spoke that made the word feel less like a statement and more like a restoration, something returning to its rightful place without force. Ethan reached into his coat then, drawing out the folded document he had taken from beneath the floor, and Clara watched as he held it for a moment, not opening it, not presenting it, just holding it, as if acknowledging what it represented. Then he extended it toward the rider, not as a surrender, not as a transfer, but as part of a process that had been set long before either of them stood there. The rider did not take it immediately. Instead, he looked at Ethan, then at Clara, and there was a question there, not spoken, but clear in its presence. Ethan answered it without words, his gaze steady, his stance unchanged, and after a moment, the rider reached out and accepted the document with a careful respect that matched the way it had been held. Clara watched the exchange closely, understanding now that this was not about ownership in the way the town would have seen it. It was about acknowledgement, about bringing something into the open that had been deliberately kept out of sight. The rider unfolded the document slightly, just enough to confirm what it contained, then closed it again, tucking it securely within his coat. "It will be known," he said, and the words carried a finality that did not end the moment, but completed it. Ethan gave a small nod, and for the first time since she had met him, Clara saw something shift in him that looked like release, not from burden, but from waiting, the quiet tension of holding something alone easing just enough to make space for what came next. The other riders remained where they were, their presence steady, their attention respectful but not intrusive, as if they understood the weight of the moment without needing to step into it. Clara felt her own place within it settle as well, not defined by the past she had come from, not by the rejection that had brought her here, but by the choice she had made to stay, to see, to understand. The rider turned his horse slightly then, not away, but toward the direction of the rising sun, and the others followed the motion without command, their formation shifting with a quiet unity that spoke of shared purpose. "There will be others who will need to hear this," he said, glancing back once more, his gaze steady on Ethan, then briefly on Clara. "But they will not hear it from us alone." Ethan's eyes followed the direction of the rider's turn, then returned to the land before him, as if seeing it not just as it was, but as it would be once the truth had been carried beyond this place. "They will hear it," he said, his voice calm, certain, and Clara understood that this was not a promise made lightly. It was a statement of something already in motion. The riders began to move then, not in haste, not in retreat, but in continuation, their figures gradually becoming part of the landscape again as they followed the line of the land toward whatever waited beyond it. Clara stood beside Ethan, watching until they were no longer distinct shapes but part of the horizon itself, and the quiet returned, not empty, but full, holding the echo of what had just been set in motion. She turned to him then, her expression steady, her voice quiet but clear. "Been choice. They trusted you with more than land," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the open space between them, and Ethan glanced at her, the faintest shift in his expression acknowledging the weight of her words. "They trusted me to hold it until it was time to return it," he replied, and the distinction mattered, not possession, but stewardship, not ownership, but responsibility carried without recognition. Clara let that settle, her eyes drifting once more across the wide stretch of ground, seeing it now not as empty space, but as something layered, something that held memory in ways the town had never cared to understand. "And now that it is returned?" she asked, turning back to him, because the question was no longer about what had been hidden, but about what would come after. Ethan took a slow breath, his shoulders easing just slightly, and for the first time since she had met him, there was no sense of waiting in him, no sense of holding back. "Now it changes," he said simply, and Clara felt the truth of that in the way the moment opened, not closing around what had just happened, but expanding beyond it. She stepped closer, her boots pressing softly into the dry earth, and looked at the shack behind them, the leaning structure that had held so much without revealing it. "And this place?" she asked, her gaze moving between the worn boards and the land beyond, because she understood now that even something as small as this could carry meaning beyond its appearance. Ethan followed her gaze, then shook his head slightly. "It served its purpose," he said, and there was no regret in his voice, only acknowledgement, as if the shack had been exactly what it needed to be for as long as it needed to be. Clara nodded, though a part of her felt the quiet weight of leaving it behind, not because of what it was, but because of what had been revealed within it. The wind moved gently across the land again, carrying with it the faint scent of dust and something new, something that felt less like the end of a chapter and more like the beginning of another. "The town will not understand," she said after a moment, her thoughts returning to Dry Creek, to the people who had laughed, who had dismissed, who had never looked closely enough to see what stood just beyond their reach. Ethan gave a small, almost thoughtful nod. "They do not need to understand," he replied, his tone calm, steady. "They only need to learn that what they ignored is not theirs to decide." Clara considered that, the difference between understanding and acceptance, between knowing and respecting, and she realized that what was coming would not be a confrontation in the way the town might expect. It would be something quieter, something that could not be argued away or dismissed with a laugh. She turned fully toward him then, her expression steady, her voice carrying a quiet certainty that matched his own. "Then we should go back," she said, not as a suggestion, but as the next step that had already taken shape. Ethan looked at her for a moment, and in that look, there was no surprise, no hesitation, only recognition, as if he had been waiting not for the idea, but for her to claim it as her own. The assumptions, the easy certainty of people who believe they understood the world around them. "They will not see it coming," she said quietly, not with judgment, but with a calm recognition of what was true. Ethan stood beside her, his gaze following the same unseen line toward the town, and his answer came without hesitation. "They were never meant to," he said, and the words settled into the morning air like something inevitable. Clara drew a slow breath, feeling the weight of what lay ahead not as a burden, but as a responsibility she had chosen, and when she stepped forward, it was not with uncertainty, but with purpose, her path now aligned with something far greater than the journey that had first brought her here. They did not speak much as they walked back toward Dry Creek, and that silence felt different from before, not uncertain, not heavy, but steady, like two people who no longer needed to explain the direction they were heading because it had already been chosen. The land stretched behind them, open and quiet, holding its secrets no longer in hiding, but in plain sight for those who knew how to see. And Clara found herself glancing back only once, not out of doubt, but out of recognition, because she understood now that what had happened there would not stay behind. It would travel with them, carried in ways no one in the town could measure. The rise that separated the shack from the town came into view slowly, the familiar line of weathered buildings beginning to take shape against the morning light, and with it came the faint sounds of life returning to its usual rhythm, voices, movement, the easy certainty of people starting a day they believed would be no different from the last. Clara felt something settle inside her as she watched it. Not anger, not resentment, but clarity, the kind that does not need to prove itself, only to stand where it belongs. "They will see you the same way at first," she said quietly, her gaze fixed on the town ahead, and Ethan gave a small nod, his expression unchanged. "That is the way they have learned to see," he replied, and there was no frustration in it, only understanding, as if he had long accepted that. People often chose the simplest version of what stood before them. They reached the edge of the town without announcement, without any need to mark their arrival, and for a moment, nothing shifted, no one turned, no one paused, and it was as if they had stepped back into a place that had already decided they did not matter. But then, slowly, that began to change. A man near the water trough looked up first, his eyes narrowing slightly as he recognized Ethan, then drifting to Clara beside him, and something in his expression flickered, not respect, not yet, but something closer to uncertainty. Another glance followed, then another, and soon the quiet awareness spread in small, almost invisible waves, people noticing, people remembering, people trying to place what did not quite fit. Clara felt it move through the street like a change in the wind, subtle but undeniable, and she kept walking, her steps steady, her posture unchanged, because she understood now that the moment did not belong to their reactions, it belonged to what would follow. They stopped near the center of the street, not because they were told to, not because anyone blocked their way, but because it was the place where everything in Dry Creek seemed to pass through, the place where decisions were made without being spoken aloud. The same man who had once dismissed Clara stood near the saloon door, his arms crossed, his expression still carrying the echo of that earlier judgment. And when he saw her now, standing beside Ethan, something in his stance shifted, not enough to be obvious, but enough to matter. "Back already," he said, his tone casual, almost dismissive, as if nothing had changed, as if he could hold on to the version of them he had already decided on. Clara did not answer. She did not need to. Ethan stepped forward instead, not aggressively, not to challenge, but simply to stand where he had always stood, only now without the weight of being unseen. "We are," he said, his voice calm, carrying just enough to reach those who had begun to gather, drawn not by noise, but by something quieter, something harder to ignore. The man's gaze lingered on Ethan for a moment, then shifted again to Clara, as if trying to understand the difference, to find the reason why this moment felt unlike the last. "Did you finally find something worth coming back for?" he asked, and there was a faint edge in the question, not quite mockery, not quite curiosity. Ethan did not respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat and drew out the absence of something that had been there before, the document no longer in his possession, the weight of it now carried elsewhere. And in that simple act, Clara saw the shift again, not in what he held, but in what he no longer needed to. "No," Ethan said after a moment, his voice even, steady. "We came back to make something known." The words did not rise, did not demand attention, but they carried across the street with a clarity that made them impossible to dismiss. And Clara saw it then, the way the small crowd that had gathered stilled, the way even those who did not fully understand felt that something had changed. The man by the saloon frowned slightly, his arms loosening just a fraction, his certainty no longer as firm as it had been. "Known?" he repeated, and this time, the question carried less confidence, more caution. Clara stepped forward then, not ahead of Ethan, but beside him, her presence steady, her voice calm as she spoke. "This land you stand on," she said, her words measured, not rushed, "does not belong to this town the way you believe it does." A murmur moved through the small crowd, not loud, not disruptive, but present, the first sign that the ground beneath their assumptions had begun to shift. The man's expression tightened, not in anger, but in resistance, the instinct to hold on to what felt certain. "And who decides that?" he asked, his voice sharper now, but still restrained, as if he sensed that pushing too hard would only reveal more than he intended. Ethan met his gaze without stepping closer, without raising his voice. And in that stillness, there was something more powerful than any argument. "It has already been decided," he said, and the simplicity of the answer carried a weight that settled over the street like a quiet storm, not loud, not violent, but impossible to ignore. Clara stood beside him, feeling the shift deepen, not in the volume of the moment, but in its direction, because this was not about convincing anyone. It was about revealing something that had been waiting to be seen, and once seen, could not be unseen. The town had not changed, not yet, but something within it had begun to move, and Clara knew, without needing to say it, that nothing after this moment would return to what it had been before. The words did not echo, but they lingered, settling into the spaces between people, into the gaps where certainty used to sit, and for a long moment, no one in Dry Creek moved to fill that silence, because something in the way it had been spoken made it clear that this was not a claim to be argued. It was a truth that had simply arrived. The man by the saloon shifted his weight, his arms no longer crossed as tightly, his posture adjusting in small, almost reluctant ways, and Clara could see it in his eyes, the moment where dismissal gave way to calculation, where certainty began to loosen its grip. Around him, others stood in quiet observation, not stepping forward, not stepping away, but watching, waiting, as if they understood that whatever came next would shape more than just this conversation. "You are saying this town does not have claim?" the man asked, his voice slower now, more measured, and Ethan met the question without hesitation, without any need to raise his tone. "I am saying the claim was never theirs to begin with," he replied, and the simplicity of the answer carried more weight than any long explanation could have, because it left no space for negotiation, no room for interpretation. Clara stood beside him, her gaze steady on the small gathering, and she noticed the way their expressions shifted, not all at once, but in pieces, one person glancing at another, a quiet exchange of uncertainty passing through them like a ripple. It was not resistance that held them back now. It was the absence of something to push against, because what stood before them was not force, it was clarity. A second man stepped forward then, older, his face lined with years spent believing he understood the land beneath his feet, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of that belief, though now it was tempered by something else. "And who stands behind that claim?" he asked, not mocking, not dismissive, but searching for the structure he had always trusted, the authority he could recognize. Ethan did not look past him, did not gesture to the horizon where the riders had gone. He simply held his ground. "Those who have always been here," he said, and Clara saw the words land, not as an answer that satisfied, but as one that could not be easily set aside. The older man's gaze lingered on Ethan, then moved briefly to Clara, as if trying to understand the presence of someone who did not fit the pattern he expected, and for a moment, she felt the weight of that attention, not as judgment, but as recognition of change. "We have built here," the man said after a pause, his voice quieter now, less certain. "We have lived here." Clara felt the truth in those words as well, not as a contradiction, but as part of a larger picture, and she stepped forward just enough for her voice to carry clearly, though she did not raise it. "That does not disappear," she said, her tone calm, grounded, "but it does not erase what came before." The man looked at her then, fully, and for the first time, there was no dismissal in his gaze, no easy assumption, only a quiet consideration, as if he was seeing her not as an outsider, not as someone to be weighed and judged, but as part of the moment unfolding before him. The street remained still, the usual sounds of morning held at a distance, as if even the town itself had paused to listen, and Clara realized that this was how change began, not with noise, not with force, but with a shift so steady it could not be undone once it started. Ethan took a slow breath, his presence unchanged, but now it carried something more, not hidden, not restrained, but fully aligned with what he had brought forward. "There will be time to understand what this means," he said, his voice even, measured. "But it begins with knowing that it is real." No one argued. No one stepped forward to challenge him. Instead, the quiet deepened, not empty, but full, holding the weight of what had been said and what had yet to be understood. Clara stood there, feeling the moment settle into place, and she knew that this was not the end of anything. It was the opening of something that would take time to unfold, to be seen in ways the town had never needed to see before. The man by the saloon lowered his arms completely now, his stance no longer defensive, and though he did not speak again, the absence of his earlier certainty said more than any words could have. The older man stepped back slightly, not retreating, but making space, and others followed in small, almost unnoticeable ways, the shape of the gathering shifting without command, without direction, as if guided by something quieter than agreement. Clara felt a small, steady breath leave her, not relief, but acknowledgement, because she understood now that what had been set in motion would not be stopped by doubt or disbelief. It would move forward in its own time, shaping the town in ways no one there could yet fully see. Ethan remained beside her, not stepping ahead, not stepping away, his presence steady, grounded, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because there was nothing more to say that needed to be heard in that moment. The sun had risen fully now, casting clear light across the street, revealing every face, every expression, every small shift that marked the beginning of something new. And Clara realized that this was how the story would be remembered, not for a single moment, not for a single statement, but for the quiet way everything changed without needing to be forced. No one raised their voice after that, and that was what stayed with Clara the most. Not the words that had been spoken, not the quiet shift in power that had passed through the street like a change in the wind, but the silence that followed, the kind that does not come from confusion, but from understanding that something irreversible has taken place. The town did not crumble, it did not erupt, it simply adjusted, slowly, almost reluctantly, like a man realizing the ground beneath him is not as steady as he believed, and there is nothing he can do but learn how to stand again. Clara watched it happen in small ways. The way people stepped back without being told, the way conversations that might have formed never quite did, the way eyes that once dismissed now lingered a second longer, not in acceptance, not yet, but in awareness. And awareness was enough. Ethan stood beside her, not speaking, not pressing forward, his presence as calm as it had always been, but now it carried a different weight, not hidden, not overlooked, simply there, undeniable. For the first time, he was not being seen as less than what he was, and for the first time, he did not need to prove anything to anyone. Clara turned slightly, her gaze moving across the familiar buildings, the saloon, the general store, the places that had felt so certain when she first arrived, and she realized that nothing about them had changed, and yet everything about them had. The meaning had shifted, and once meaning shifts, it never returns to what it was. The older man who had spoken earlier stepped forward again, but this time his posture was different, not defensive, not questioning, simply present, and when he looked at Ethan, there was something in his eyes that had not been there before, something quieter, something that did not ask for explanation. "We will need to understand this," he said, his voice low, steady, and Ethan nodded once, not as permission, not as command, but as acknowledgement that understanding would come in its own time. Clara felt a small shift inside her then, a sense of completion that did not close the story, but settled it into place, because she understood now that what mattered had already happened, not in the exchange of words, not in the presence of the writers, but in the choice that had been made before any of that, the choice to stay when there was nothing to gain, the choice to see what others refused to see. She glanced at Ethan, and for a brief moment, their eyes met, and in that look, there was no need for explanation, no need for reassurance, only a quiet recognition of everything that had brought them to this point. The man by the saloon stepped aside then, not dramatically, not as a gesture, but simply moving out of the path as if it had always been the natural thing to do, and that small movement carried more meaning than anything he could have said. Others followed in subtle ways, space opening where it had once been closed, not forced, not commanded, but chosen. Clara felt the weight of that, not as victory, but as alignment, as something settling into its proper place without the need for conflict. The wind moved gently through the street, carrying the faint sound of distant horses, of life continuing beyond the edges of what could be seen, and Clara realized that the story she had stepped into was no longer about survival, no longer about proving worth. It was about standing in truth without needing to raise a hand or a voice. Ethan turned slightly, his gaze moving once more across the town, not claiming it, not rejecting it, simply seeing it as it was. And then he looked back at Clara, and for the first time, there was something like ease in his expression, not relief, but the absence of waiting. "It will take time," he said quietly, and Clara nodded, because she understood that time was not something to be feared here. It was something that allowed truth to settle, to take root in ways that could not be undone. "I have time," she replied, and the words felt different now than they would have the day before. Not uncertain, not hopeful, but certain in a way that came from knowing where you stand. The sun climbed higher, casting clear light across everything, leaving no shadow to hide behind, and the town, for all its unchanged appearance, felt like a different place entirely. Clara took a slow breath, letting it out steadily, and she realized that the journey that had brought her here, the rejection, the uncertainty, the moment she had turned back instead of walking away, had not been leading her to a man with hidden wealth. It had been leading her to a moment where character mattered more than circumstance, where the quiet choice to stay had become the turning point of everything that followed. Ethan did not reach for her hand, did not make any grand gesture. He simply stood beside her, present, steady, and in that stillness, Clara understood something deeper than anything that had been spoken, that out here, in a place where people often believe power came from what you could take or what you could show, the strongest thing a person could hold on to was not wealth, not land, not even recognition, but the kind of character that remained when there was nothing to gain. The town would remember this day, not because of what was taken or given, but because of what was revealed without force, without conflict, without a single raised voice. And as Clara stood there, looking out over a place that no longer felt uncertain, she realized that justice had not arrived with noise or spectacle. It had arrived the moment someone chose to see clearly, to stay when leaving would have been easier, and to stand quietly in truth when the world expected something else. Out here, justice did not need a gun. It only needed someone willing to stand still long enough for it to be seen. Thanks for watching this story. Subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt stories. Your support helps keep these stories alive. Tell me in the comments what you felt about this story and what kind of stories you want to see next. See you in the next story.